Hello. Well, that was a real delight. Thanks so much for that trivia. It's now my pleasure to introduce our third speaker of the day, the internationally renowned rhythm and synchronization expert, Peter Keller. I've always been very impressed with Peter's work, not only for its quality and its rigor, but also its sheer breadth. He's published widely and thoroughly on many aspects of rhythm perception and production, synchronization, interpersonal coordination, with key studies in both behavioral and neuroscientific perspectives. In terms of his interest in rhythm, he comes by it honestly, with formal training not only in psychology, but also in music. I believe he's a trombonist. After his degrees, he held a series of increasingly prominent positions, first starting a research group at the Max Planck Institute, and then moving on to eventually serve as director of research at MARCS, the Institute for Brain Behavior and Development at Western Sydney. And after several years there, he was recruited by the Center for Music and the Brain at Aarhus University, where he started a new position several weeks ago, and he's just settling in. Peter gave at least one other talk at NeuroMusic. I remember about 7 or 8 years ago, he came to campus, and at that time I got to meet up with him in person. And I remember asking him where he wanted to meet as long as he was in town. And I don't know if Peter recalls this interaction, but he was interested in experiencing Canada as Canadians do. And so his dream location was actually at Tim Hortons. So I met him at Tim Hortons for some coffee, and I don't know if they have that kind of delicacy where you're at now in Denmark, but Peter, I picked this up for you here. And since it's getting close to 11 p.m. your time, I'll just drink this throughout your talk to help you power through that. So I'm really looking forward to him sharing his latest findings now on sensory motor interactions, interpersonal coordination, and social influences. So please welcome our third speaker, Peter Keller.
Hi, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to present my work here. The title of my talk is From Sensory Motor to Social Influences on Rhythmic Interpersonal Coordination. Why from sensory motor to social? Well, the way in which humans interact through music can be seen as a microcosm of social interaction. In other words, participation in collective musical activities draws on a broad spectrum of sensory, perceptual, cognitive, motor, and emotional processes that support other forms of collaborative behavior in everyday life. Apart from conceptual gains associated with this view, there's the practical benefit that music provides a suitable playing field for balancing ecological naturalness and experimental control in research. Musical paradigms constitute a platform for parametrically modeling the complexity of human social interaction, from the study of individuals interacting with recordings to live mutual interactions between ensemble performers and audience members. And why the focus on rhythmic interpersonal coordination? For a start, it's a fundamental aspect of musical interaction. Also, it occurs in other domains, including sport, teamwork, troop marching, etc., where it's often supported by music. And while rhythmic interpersonal coordination showcases the remarkable human capacity for precise yet flexible social synchrony in real time, it is also characterized by marked variation in how it's expressed. Such variation can be observed between individuals, as well as across musical styles and cultures, where systematic variations in the degree of asynchrony suggest that ensemble coordination is purposefully shaped to fulfill specific social and aesthetic functions. The empirical approach that I adopt to understand such variations relies on a telescopic research strategy. It considers the relationship between behavior in the context of naturalistic ensemble performance, as well as laboratory tasks designed to interrogate specific psychological processes under controlled conditions. For example, tapping a finger in time with an auditory pacing sequence produced by a computer or another person. We also consider assessments of personality obtained through psychometric tests, and then a deeper understanding of the relationships that we observe is sought in work with computational models and computer simulations. Finally, the neurophysiological mechanisms underpinning the processes that we identify are investigated by using a range of neuroscientific tools to examine brain structure and function. To guide research on the psychology of ensemble performance, and more generally rhythmic interpersonal coordination, I've developed a theoretical framework that aims to account for individual differences and stylistic variations by focusing on sensory motor and cognitive processes that enable real-time coordination. These processes, which I refer to as ensemble skills, allow co-performers first to anticipate or predict the timing of each other's sounds, second, to adapt to unanticipated variations in timing, and third, to divide attention between their own actions and those of others while monitoring the overall integrated ensemble sound. It's assumed that these three ensemble skills interact with one another to determine the quality of ensemble coordination, or generally group synchrony. Furthermore, these skills are influenced by each individual's knowledge about the music and familiarity with co-performers' playing styles. It's also influenced by co-performers' goals concerning the interaction, as well as strategies such as assigning leadership roles. And finally, at a higher level, it's influenced by social psychological factors such as personality. A study conducted some years ago with piano duos provided preliminary evidence for the validity of the core assumption of this framework. Pianists' keystrokes were recorded on electronic instruments as they performed a selection of pieces, and a motion capture system was used to record their ancillary body sway motion, which plays a role in regulating timing and in the communication of musical expression. It was found that duos comprising pianists with high scores on laboratory tasks assessing anticipation, adaptation, and attention capacities displayed higher keystroke synchrony and optimal body sway coordination. Subsequent work has shed light on the nature of the relationship between ensemble skills. One study by former PhD student Peter Mills showed that individual estimates of adaptation, indexed by a measure of phase correction, and anticipation, reflected in a temporal prediction index, are positively correlated, presumably because they rely on a common timekeeping network in the brain. Nevertheless, hierarchical regression analyses revealed that a sizable amount of variance in sensory motor synchronization skill is explained by combined independent contributions of adaptive and anticipatory processes. To help understand the links between the three ensemble skills, several colleagues and I have developed a computational model, which we call ADAM, the Adaptation and Anticipation Model. ADAM has four main parameters: two types of error correction, represented by parameters alpha and beta, are implemented in an adaptation module based on asynchronies between one zone and other sounds. A third parameter, delta, controls temporal predictions in an anticipation module by weighting processes of extrapolation versus perseveration of earlier inter-onset intervals between other sounds. The adaptation module provides input to a self-internal model that plans the timing of one's own next action, while the anticipation module provides input to an other internal model that generates a prediction about the timing of the other's next sound. A joint internal model computes the discrepancy between outputs of the self and other internal models and implements anticipatory correction according to the parameter gamma to reduce this discrepancy by adjusting one's own action plan before a motor command is issued. This joint internal model essentially regulates the proportion of attention allocated to psychological representations of self and other, affecting their overlap. Model parameters can be estimated for individual participants based on behavioral time series data from tasks requiring sensory motor synchronization with so-called virtual partners. Such tasks involve drumming in time with computer-controlled auditory sequences that adapt to the participants' tap timing to varying degrees or contain varying amounts of tempo change. ADAM parameter estimates not only reveal the extent of individual differences in ensemble skills, but also how these skills combine to predict an individual's sensory motor synchronization abilities. Taking the procedure into the MRI scanner has allowed us to identify brain networks associated with each atom module, and we've used a type of functional connectivity analysis to probe how these networks work together to support precise yet flexible sensory motor synchronization. Overall results suggest that the brain's resting state networks are reconfigured by a rich club of hub regions that tune the brain's level of metastability, that is, ability to switch states. This allows the balance of self-other integration and segregation to be varied by rapid transitions to neural states that differ in terms of the breadth of attention and the degree to which it's targeted internally or externally. More generally, metastable patterns of connectivity allow the interaction of a wide range of processes, from sensory motor to social cognitive, to be accommodated. Indeed, in a bigger picture, suitability for regulating brain metastability and processing along a gradient from sensory motor to social might be one of the evolutionary advantages of music making. Niels Hansen and I recently argued this, proposing that the neurochemical oxytocin plays a role in promoting behavioral flexibility in interpersonal coordination dynamics across a range of social contexts. But today I'll focus on more grounded empirical work addressing sources of individual differences in rhythmic interpersonal coordination skills. I'll do this at 3 levels. First, basic sensory motor and core cognitive skills, then higher cognitive processes, and finally, personality. Okay, sensory motor and core cognitive skills. One line of work done in collaboration with Sylvie Nazaradan has examined neuroindices of temporal adaptation and anticipation using steady-state evoked potentials recorded with EEG. Auditory steady-state evoked potentials provide a measure of neural resonance to the musical beat, that is, the regular sense of pulse underlying much musical rhythm. Beat-related SSEPs are relatively strong in response to unsyncopated or regular rhythms where physical sound onsets trigger exogenously driven beat induction. Beat-related SSEPs are weaker, but still present with syncopated rhythms where there's less acoustic energy at the beat frequency and therefore beat induction is more endogenously driven. With regard to individual differences, it turns out that people who are good at synchronizing movements with a steady beat, requiring adaptation via phase coupling, display generally strong beat-related SSEPs. These effects are likely to be sensory motor in origin. By contrast, individual differences in the ability to predict tempo changes during sensory motor synchronization are related specifically to the endogenous component of beat generation, which can be isolated by subtracting SSEPs for unsyncopated rhythms from SSEPs for syncopated rhythms. This endogenous or top-down aspect points to a cognitive component. Consistent with this, related work has demonstrated that temporal prediction is linked to working memory and auditory imagery. A study with Ian Coley and Andrea Halpin found that individual differences in the ability to predict tempo changes while tapping in synchrony with expressively timed music were correlated with independent tasks assessing working memory, as well as the flexibility with which images of sounds can be controlled and mental imagery for time intervals. In other words, the capacity to store, process, and transform beat intervals in memory contributes to an individual's ability to anticipate tempo changes performed by another individual. You'll notice that a fair slice of variance is not explained by these factors. Indeed, there is a sensory motor component to temporal anticipation. This can be seen in the results of a study where we use transcranial alternating current stimulation, or TACS, to align predictions in pairs of participants performing a dyadic finger tapping task. TACS allows the period and phase of brain activity to be experimentally controlled to some degree. In our study, we placed the anodal electrode above the left motor cortex of each individual and delivered the current at 3 frequencies, starting a few seconds before each trial. 2 hertz, which corresponded to the target tapping tempo, and the people tapped with their right hand. 10 hertz, which corresponds to a dominant brain rhythm that turns out to be informative in a range of social interaction tasks, and 20 hertz beta, a rhythm that's intimately linked to motor processing. What we found was that only in-phase beta stimulation boosted interpersonal coordination. It might be the case that this stimulation protocol was conducive to individuals learning each other's action style, specifically their variations in start time and tempo, and using this information to generate predictions about each other's action timing by a process of covert action simulation in the motor system. Right. Rhythmic interpersonal coordination is often a matter of balancing priorities related to one's own actions and the interaction of self and other. Insights by expert ensemble performers hint at this balancing act. A member of the trio Wanderer puts it as follows: it's like a holy trinity. It's three individuals in a group. Both things, by which he means individuality and group, are equal and very important. So successful group performance requires some degree of self-other merging without losing the distinction between self and other. Integration is needed to represent shared goals and to monitor and evaluate joint action outcomes. Segregation is needed for agency attribution and autonomous movement control. Attention may play a regulatory function by a process that has been termed prioritized integrative attending. This involves simultaneously paying attention to one's own actions and those of others, while also monitoring the overall integrated ensemble or group output. The idea is that the balance can be varied continuously based on current demands. Work with Manuel Vallet, my colleague in Sydney, used a variant of the steady state evoked potential approach to study this process in a dyadic or joint movement improvisation task. In this visual motor task, participants were required to synchronize their free-form finger trajectories, very much like in the mirror game studied by Leonoy and others. The trick here was that a light-emitting diode attached to each individual's finger flickered at a distinct frequency, 5.7 or 7.7 hertz. This allowed us to get an index of the relative balance of self-other integration and segregation by examining EEG amplitude at the intermodulation frequency, 13.4 hertz, the sum of 5.7 and 7.7. What we found was that stronger self-other integration, that is, higher dual intermodulation SSEP amplitude, was associated with stronger behavioral coupling, that is, lower standard deviation of interpersonal distance. Extending the paradigm to the auditory modality, a step closer to music performance, then highlighted the importance of self-other segregation. Here we had paired participants applying finger pressure on a sensor to modulate the timbral brightness of carrier sounds that either had the same or different fundamental frequency across participants, 200 or 500 hertz. In this case, we used acoustic envelope frequency tagging with individual frequencies of 33 and 47 hertz, giving rise to intermodulation frequencies of 14 hertz, that's 47 minus 33, and 80 hertz, 47 plus 33. The main finding was that while self-other integration was higher when carrier sound frequency was matched across participants, interpersonal synchrony was best when sound frequency was different. People presumably lost track of themselves when self-other segregation was difficult. Of course, many real-life instances of rhythmic interpersonal coordination take place via both visual and auditory information exchange. We address this in a behavioral study using a simple music box task in people without formal musical training. They played a familiar tune, it was Somewhere Over the Rainbow, by rotating the handles of each music box. What we varied was the match in sound pitches, either unison or 2 octaves apart, and movement frequency. We did that by programming the boxes to require the same or different degrees of rotation per beat. Interpersonal coordination was best, that is, asynchronies were lowest, when sounds were different, but movement frequencies were the same. People really drifted apart in all other conditions. We interpreted this to indicate that coordination was facilitated when simultaneous self-other integration and segregation occurred across sensory modalities in an asymmetrical manner, where pitch relations favored segregation, while movement congruence favored integration. To return to the theme of individual differences, the situation might be different in musical experts. Through experience interacting with their instruments and with other performers, musicians develop finely calibrated internal models that represent sensory motor associations related to one's own and others' actions. These associations can be used to enhance the efficiency of planning and predictive control processes. We saw this in an EEG study of error processing in piano duos. The task required the pianist to play tricky passages rapidly in unison or in octaves. We were interested in how the brain sorts out who committed an error and how this process is affected by potential agency confusions when playing in unison. First, we found that interpersonal keystroke asynchronies were not affected by whether feedback was ambiguous, that is, same pitches, or unambiguous, different pitches. Likewise, when we looked at error-related negative and positive event-related potentials in the EEG data, we found differences based on types of errors that people made, insertions of extra notes versus wrong note replacements, but no effect of whether feedback was ambiguous. These results suggest that expert brains have no trouble sorting out who is who rapidly enough to allow fluent coordination in the face of unexpected events. Now we turn to the role of higher cognitive processes in individual differences in rhythmic interpersonal coordination, specifically knowledge and goals. One study investigated the effects of shared knowledge and goals, again in piano duos. Paired pianists situated in separate rooms were asked to play together under conditions that varied in terms of co-performer knowledge, that is, whether or not they were familiar with each other's parts, and temporal goals, that is, the congruence of the tempi or rates at which they were instructed to play. The general task involved playing duets consisting of 2 simple phrases with an intervening pause. Before coming to the lab, pianists practiced both their own and their partner's part for half of the pieces, so that both parts were familiar, but practiced only their own part for the other half, so that the other's part was unfamiliar for these items. Then, prior to each experimental trial, visual cues instructed participants whether to speed up or slow down for the second phrase. These tempo instructions were either congruent or incongruent between pianists. Audio was turned off during the pause between phrases, so participants weren't aware of this tempo congruence manipulation. When looking at the first phrase, which is what we're primarily interested in, we found a dissociation between the effects of familiarity and tempo congruence on behavioral measures of interpersonal synchronization accuracy and coupling strength. Specifically, there was a main effect of tempo congruence for accuracy, where asynchronies were smaller in the tempo congruent condition than the incongruent condition. This indicates that participants played better in synchrony when planning the same impending tempo change than when planning different tempo changes. With respect to a measure of coupling strength, however, we found only a main effect of familiarity. The lag zero cross-correlation of inter-keystroke intervals is negative to the extent that mutual coupling is high. Here we can see evidence for stronger coupling when the other's part was unfamiliar. This is presumably because in that case, the performers are more likely to attend to the other part. With regard to the EEG data, we examined power in the alpha frequency band, around 10 Hertz, as an index of the use of internal, that is knowledge base, and external or environmental sources of information. Generally, alpha suppressions associated with increased cortical excitability, reflecting the selective processing of task-relevant information. Alpha enhancement, on the other hand, has been linked to processes that serve to inhibit task-irrelevant information. What we found was an interactive effect of familiarity and tempo congruence on alpha power. Specifically, there was a greater effect of goal congruence when the other's part was familiar and interpersonal coupling was weaker. Recall what I said earlier about metastability. So, when the other's part is familiar and is being played in sync, external and internal information match, and so an external focus of attention is conducive to self-other integration, reflected in alpha suppression. However, when the other part is familiar but played slightly out of sync, the mismatch encourages an internal focus of attention that facilitates self-other segregation, reflected in alpha enhancement. Goal incongruence in this previous study was quite subtle, actually. What about more obvious incongruencies, the sledgehammer approach? In a study with Jennifer McRitchie, we went a step further in terms of devious manipulations by giving pianists scores with either the same or different expressive markings. Congruent expressive tempo goals meant that both pianists were instructed to get faster or slower together. Incongruent goals meant that one was supposed to get faster as the other got slower. The pianists practiced these parts alone, unbeknownst to one another, before they came to the lab. And then they were required to play without visual contact or the opportunity to talk. Results obviously show that incongruent goals disrupt synchrony, but asynchrony decreases steeply across repeat performances. Non-verbal negotiation takes place rapidly. This negotiation was reflected in changes in relative focus on joint performance versus individual performance. Joint focus, reflected in the correlation between the two pianists' timing profiles, was constant across tempo congruency conditions. By contrast, individual focus, reflected in the correlation between each pianist's tempo profile and the target profile specified in their score, was relatively low in the incongruent condition. Linear mixed effects modeling confirms that only the change in individual performance is predictive of the incongruency condition. So, pianists abandoned or sacrificed their individual goals in the incongruent condition. This compromise was done asymmetrically, a case of one participant adapting to the other. Collectively, these two studies suggest the presence of a goal congruence thresholding mechanism. Specifically, the balance between self-other integration and segregation is influenced by the degree to which individual expressive goals differ. Subtle goal incongruence, as in the November et al. Study, encourages self-other segregation, whereas high incongruence, as in the McRitchie sledgehammer study, tips the balance towards integration. The implication is that individuals have a threshold at which it becomes necessary to revise and modify their goals in order to achieve precise coordination. Yeah, okay, I kept this rather scary schematic of internal models for self, other, and joint actions hidden earlier, but I'm revealing it now briefly to show that such a thresholding mechanism, highlighted in red, can be accommodated in our general theoretical framework. Finally, let's consider sources of individual differences related to personality. We'll focus on two dimensions: relations between locus of control and temporal adaptation, and relations between empathy and temporal anticipation. Locus of control refers to the tendency to attribute life events to internal causes, that is, one's own decisions and acts, or external causes, the influence of others or environmental events. This aspect of personality can be assessed using an instrument where the internality subscale is relevant for us, with items such as whether or not I get to be leader depends mostly on my ability. For empathy, that is the capacity to understand others' thoughts and feelings, we're particularly interested in the perspective-taking aspect, that is the tendency to spontaneously adopt others' psychological points of view. In previous work, we tested the relationship between locus of control and adaptation using a task that required synchronization with unstable virtual partners that were prone to tempo drift. The optimal strategy is to split priorities between synchronizing with the partner and maintaining the target tempo. We found that individuals with an internal locus of control didn't do this. They employed lower adaptation than external individuals, instead prioritizing the stability of their own performance. This is suggestive of a kind of selfish leader strategy of focusing on one's own performance and essentially ignoring the other person, the follower. Consistent with this, functional MRI revealed that activation in brain areas related to self-monitoring was stronger in internal locus of control leaders than in the followers. The relationship between empathy and anticipation was tested in a different sort of experiment using a music box task similar to the one I described earlier. But this time, we first administered a questionnaire to assess empathic perspective taking in a large sample of individuals. Based on this assessment, we then paired each individual who was high in empathy with another high empathy person, and each individual who was low in empathy with another low empathy person. When these pairs came into the lab to do the music box task, we found that the amount of asynchrony between sounds produced by members of the high empathy pairs was much smaller than the asynchrony in low empathy pairs. And importantly, in a condition where leader-follower roles were assigned, the designated leaders made their performance tempo more regular, similarly in high and low empathy pairs, presumably a case of a coordination smoother applied to assist followers. But what we found was that high empathy followers were better able to use this information to predict the leader behavior. Further evidence for the link between empathy and temporal prediction comes from an fMRI study in which participants tapped in synchrony with auditory sequences containing tempo changes resembling those found in expressively timed music. A parametric analysis received 3 main networks associated with a behavioral measure of the strength of temporal prediction. Consistent with the focus today on processes ranging from sensory motor to social, these brain networks can be characterized as supporting sensory motor integration, action simulation, and social cognitive evaluations. Most noteworthy, however, is the neat overlap between the social cognitive network and activations found in studies of empathy outside the music domain, for pain of all things. While the work I just described looked at the relationship between different aspects of personality and different ensemble skills in separate studies, we recently completed a study that charts links between behavioral performance, ADAM parameter estimates of ensemble skills, and personality assessments in a single design. In the study, we used dyadic synchronization tasks of the general form where pairs of participants struck electronic drum pads in synchrony with an auditory pacing sequence and then continued in time with one another after the external sequence ended. The sequence and participants were each associated with distinctive percussive sounds. The task varied in terms of tempo profiles, a regular steady tempo, or variable tempo changes, and the general tempo range, fast or slow. Also, for the tempo changing task, we manipulated leader-follower roles via instructions. Either no leader was assigned, or one individual was designated as the leader and the other the follower. The results I'm reporting today are for the tempo changing conditions only. When we applied ADAM to estimate each individual's parameter use related to adaptation, specifically period correction, anticipation, that is a prediction tracking coefficient, and joint modeling or anticipatory error correction, we found that only period correction was reliably influenced by the leadership manipulation. As expected, followers adapted more than leaders, and adaptation was intermediate when leader-follower roles weren't assigned. Digging deeper, we performed regression analyses where we entered averaged and differenced pair measures in stepwise order, first for period correction or beta, then prediction tracking coefficients or delta, and then anticipatory error correction or gamma. The first outcome was that high period correction averaged across pair members was associated with low asynchrony or good coordination. And then Greater difference in the degree of prediction tracking between pair members was associated with higher asynchrony. This seems to indicate asymmetrical leader-follower relations, but apparently not those that were instructed. And these spontaneous leader-follower relations turned out to be detrimental to performance. Turning to personality, we found a dissociation between patterns of correlations for locus of control and empathic perspective taking with adaptation or period correction and anticipation, prediction tracking. Internal locus of control was positively correlated with period correction. Recall that our earlier study by Fairhurst et al. Showed that internal locus of control individuals focus on stabilizing their own timing when faced with unstable virtual partners. The new finding now that internal locus of control people engage in more period correction in the context of systematic tempo changes is consistent insofar as it suggests that internal locus of control is associated with the ability to control one's internal timekeeper. When it's beneficial to be stable, this control allows the period to be kept constant. However, when it's beneficial to change tempo, this control allows the period to be adjusted flexibly. And with regard to empathy, we see that high perspective taking is generally associated with stronger prediction. This extends previous findings by showing the relationship with specific model parameter estimates. So, we've identified personality correlates of adaptation and anticipation, but what about self-other integration and Adam's joint module? A dyadic drumming study suggests that we might need to go to yet a higher level and consider social beliefs. In the study, pairs of participants drummed in separate rooms as we varied instructions as to whether the sounds they could hear were generated by another person or by a computer controlled by the experimenter. Importantly, both participants were always in fact interacting with a computer-controlled virtual partner that was programmed to engage in adaptive timing like another human would. It turns out that individuals have subjective preferences for interacting with another human versus a computer, and these preferences are reflected in their objective performance. People who prefer humans have smaller asynchronies when they believe they're interacting with another person, while people who prefer computers do the opposite. When we applied Adam to estimate each individual's parameter use related to adaptation, anticipation, and joint model processes, we found that gamma parameter settings in the joint model were responsible for these effects. Human fanciers engaged in more self-other integration under the human partner instruction, while computer fanciers integrated better under the computer instruction. This suggests that social biases about how cooperative a partner is can influence the weighting of information about self and other. Okay, to conclude, basic sensory motor and core cognitive ensemble skills interact with knowledge and goals to facilitate rhythmic interpersonal coordination. Individual differences arise not only due to variations in capacities at these levels, but also due to specific associations between ensemble skills and personality. These links between basic sensory motor mechanisms and higher level social cognitive processes play a role in regulating the balance between self-other integration and segregation, and thereby the relationship between psychological representations of self and other. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention, and thanks to my collaborators and funders.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that fantastic overview of quite a lot of studies there. Oh, wow. It looks like you're partying it up with quite the virtual background. So very impressive. So the questions are rolling in here. So I'll just read them off in the order they come in. So Frank Rousseau said, thanks so much for the great talk. Can you say more about your measure of alpha synchronization and desynchronization in your studies of duets? Is the alpha attributed to any brain network in particular, and how is it localized?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Frank. For that particular study, we only had 19 electrodes which is a little too few to do reliable source estimation. We didn't attempt that. I can't really go back to the slides now, but you maybe recall there was kind of right lateralized, sort of slightly posterior, and we from other studies and what other people have written, that seems to be consistent at some level since then. I don't know if all the co-authors would agree, but I'm thinking a possible generator is posterior cingulate precuneus, perhaps. It's consistent with the MRI study that I showed you, where we had the model parameters applied to data as people were tapping in the scanner, and then use functional connectivity analyses to extract information about networks associated with each of the atom parameters. And there we found that that particular region seemed to be an important one for regulating this balance between the external and internal sources of information, or other and self in the case of interpersonal coordination. But we can't really nail it from that particular EEG study because of the lack of density in the electrode array.
Thank you. So we've got another question here saying, aside from the talk, whoops, sorry, wrong chat window. So I was wondering, as you were talking, one of the first studies you mentioned involved giving people a 20 hertz boost while they were tapping at different rates, and you found that that was assisting with their synchronization. Did you also try that with levels that weren't aligned with the tapping? So like a 21 hertz boost with the 2 hertz tapping, or a 20 hertz boost with a 2.5 hertz tapping?
No, in fact, yeah, that's a good point. We did do in-phase and anti-phase stimulation, and found that the boost was just with the in-phase stimulation, but an actual different stimulation frequency that was not harmonically related. No, to be honest, with this particular first study, there was a fair amount of skepticism whether it would work at all. So we really wanted to go for the most straightforward approach. As you know, as people might know, these frequency ranges for different frequency bands in the brain vary between individuals, just as everything else does. And in fact, one possible way, if this were to continue, one can estimate in each individual the peak of activity, using EEG for different frequency bands. And for some individuals, it varies a lot for alpha. And we actually do analyses. The later study where we were reporting from the EEG, we calculate power around the peak for individuals, because it does really vary a lot, and to some degree with beta as well. So we might want to measure with EEG the peak for each individual, and stimulated that custom particular tailored to the individual frequency. And that, I think, would be the way, perhaps the way to do it. And then we would, if the tapping tempo is the same in all cases, we would definitely dissociate those, maybe along the lines you're suggesting.
Excellent. So we've got a talk here from Laurel, who's saying, you mentioned alpha several times, but you also mentioned beta was important in the TAC study. Why do you think beta frequency, why was the beta frequency important, do you think? Yeah,
I think, and I don't have evidence for this yet. I do have data, which if I had time to analyze them, there might be evidence for this, that the function of activity in these different frequency bands varies, and I think it might vary in a way that's linked to, of course, many different things in different contexts, but in the context we're talking about here, with the processes captured by the atom model parameters. So, I think that there's one complication that I'll get to in a moment, that beta related to motor predictions, so the anticipation module, theta probably with the phase correction, the adaptation module generally. And with the balance between integration and segregation, the joint module, that's where we think that possibly, from a study that was actually just accepted a few days ago, gamma might be involved, but also especially alpha, due to this reflecting the balance of focus on external and internal information. Now, why I mentioned two and why I mentioned an integrate aspect is I think that perhaps the way forward is not just to look at power and phase or coherence in particular frequency bands, but really cross-frequency band coupling is important for understanding communication and transfer information within the brain, and maybe as Stephanie was talking about earlier in the first talk, between brains as well.
Excellent. Okay, so a question here about taking a step back from the many studies you've talked about here. Are there any specific implications or recommendations you can make for how we're training musicians in terms of applying some of these findings?
Yes, and that's something that I'd like to do with maybe more commitment than I've had the opportunity to so far. Yeah, pedagogical implications. One is that how does one train individuals to get their best out of themselves as ensemble performers? Traditionally, a lot of techniques are aimed at acquiring skills as a soloist, but of course, in the meantime, I think in recent years, certainly in early education, for serious musical training or formal musical training, there are more systematic approaches to teaching how to perform well in an ensemble. But in terms of the actual understanding the mechanisms underlying that, maybe not so much is known because this research is all ongoing. And how could that inform pedagogical applications is the thing where research is needed. And the general idea was that students will have individual differences and they will have strengths and maybe weaknesses in some areas. And if this can be diagnosed using the sorts of approaches that I mentioned, maybe one can then target particular techniques and strategies, compensatory strategies, or activities to boost any areas that are weak. For example, if reactions are very good, but predictions aren't that good, one can develop techniques that focus specifically on predictions. So one thing is to assess ensemble skills. So not just to assess globally whether somebody seems to be doing a good job, but actually what aspects of the job are particularly good or not so good, and where more effort could be directed to improve. That's one aspect in terms of the behavioral and modeling approach. But then one gets into a little bit maybe risky territory. I think I heard a comment that, yeah, maybe some people wouldn't be, I think Stephanie mentioned this when she talked about Giacomo's, this tax study, that maybe, in some context, one wouldn't be comfortable with brain stimulation, albeit non-invasive brain stimulation. But you could imagine some mad scientists, music educators wanting to use these techniques in a more active way. I'm not advocating this. I think we need to understand what's going on a lot more before we even think about any interventions that go beyond strategic suggestions.
Fair enough. I've got another question here from Laurel about, do you think that different musical interaction types might involve different processing of self and other? For example, improvisation versus learned music or sheet music reading?
Yeah, possibly, to the extent that, the emphasis between self and other more generally, as some of the work that I was mentioning, reflects focusing on external and internal sources of information. So if you think about improvisation, despite obviously often depending on the genre of it, the style of it, depending on some sort of library of learned patterns and combining those in different ways, but nevertheless, the creative process and the decisions are made on the fly, so very internally guided versus sheet music reading being externally guided, especially in sight reading. Of course, one gets into the area when it's internalized through memorization. It's internally guided, but it was external, and there it's a difference in time that separates which is which. But actually, one example I can give now that I've thought about it or rambled about it for a while, is a study that we in fact conducted with improvisers, where we got them in. This came out of it, by the way, I'll mention quickly, a bet with my sister, who is a improvising pianist, very prominent one in Australia. And I asked her, after listening to a new CD that she sent, one of the melodies, it was arrangements of Bartók Mikrokosmos for a quintet, a jazz quintet. So it was composed music, but obviously they were improvising on it. But I don't know Mikrokosmos, and I was listening to one of the melodies, and she played something, and I found it very very captivating. And I asked her whether that was improvised or that was Bartók writing, and she looked at me as if how can I not know? How can I know that? Isn't it obvious when somebody's improvising? So we struck a bet that we'll do a study where we get people into the lab and they improvise over backing tracks, which she recorded. And then we transcribe the improvisations, take bits that sound, musically high quality, and then get them to come in and learn those. We send them the music, we send them recordings, and they have to produce complete facsimiles of it, and come back to the lab and record those imitations of either their own or other improvisations. And then we looked at it's a comment that the comment about yelling is not directed at me, is it?
I don't know. Hopefully it's not directed at me.
Anyway, I'll continue with the story until you cut me off. You're the chair, Mike. What we found was that when, same notes being played, but when we on electronic pianos, we looked at the entropy of the force distributions, the MIDI velocity. We found that for the improvisations, there was higher entropy, and we attribute that to greater fluctuations in uncertainty about what's going to happen next. And I'm getting to the point, Laurel. We did then a listening study in the scanner where we brought a new set of pianists into the MRI scanner while they listened and decided whether each item was improvised or imitated. We found that generally people were above chance, but it was correlated with two things. One is activity in a motor simulation network, and one is perspective taking skills and actually experience at playing in ensembles as well. So I think this hints at that there would be a relationship between these processes at that level. Okay.
Didn't mean to cut you off. Was it the end?
That was the end. I'm also reading the questions, but I'll let you.
So another question, more shifting back to a performance perspective. So as you know, in a concert, there's a lot of factors that go into play in terms of the connection between the ensemble members. Things like the acoustics of the space, how familiar they are with the venue, audience reactions, those kinds of things. How do those get incorporated into this ADAM model?
Well, okay, so they don't at the level of the formal aspects of the model, the linear autoregressive equations that I flashed up briefly. But the joint module is linked to attention, and attention is vectored those. So the one paper that I did cite on the slide with the trio of Undera, the prioritized integrative attending, the 2001 paper in Psychology of Music actually has a list of these factors obtained through interviewing musicians about what things influence them and influence their ability to divide attention between themselves and others. And actually the things that you mentioned are all on that list as well. And in that model, there is, it's speculative, it's not a formal aspect of the model, an idea about how they can influence things. I haven't got the figure at hand, but it's influenced by work by Daniel Kahneman, actually. His older work, not the work he got the Nobel Prize for, actually. His book Attention and Effort from 1973, I think. There he has an intriguing diagram based on studies of pupil dilation in relations to effort, where it shows them fluctuating at a scale that could be seen to reflect metrical levels. And I think in more recent years, just in the last 2 or 3 years, there has been work looking at that in the pupil dilation in the context of musical rhythm. So to get to the point, there are two things that are fluctuating in terms of attention. One is the availability of resources, and one is the activity of resources. And I'm imagining the diagram in the figure, but of course none of you have seen this or wouldn't know it. But it fluctuates in accordance with metric structure and metric accent structure. Events are more likely to occur on strong beats than weak beats. So there's more likely to be activity, resource activity for processing information at those locations. And at the same time, the availability of resources is fluctuating in a way that in ideal circumstances can accommodate fluctuations in attentional activity. And what these external things are doing, the music is affecting the activity, but the other extraneous variables are affecting availability. So that's the way, but it's not formally in the model. But if one goes and looks at that 2001 paper, you'd see how I would do it if I had time to actually tie those things up properly.
Great, that's helpful. I talk about that in my Intro to Music Psychology class, and I've got some additional information I can work in there.
Oh, good. Okay, great.
Yeah, excellent. So at one point in the talk, you had this nice figure on a continuum of naturalness, where it was like full ensemble on one side, then smaller groups in the middle, and then sound booth with the metronome on one end. So I was curious, how did you consider duet playing to be a less natural form of music making than a full ensemble, and how does that play a role in synchrony?
Well, yeah, okay, that's a big question. Natural. Okay, ecological naturalness. People use the word ecological validity. Not really. That's not the way the figure was intended. I can say that. I mean, I have to ask Alessandro D'Arsilio and Giacomo and Luciano Fadiga what they think. But in my mind, that's not the way the figure was intended. Although, if you think about the papers that were discussed before in BBS earlier in the trivia quiz, at least, do talk about evolutionary reasoning behind musical capacities. And some of those ideas, range from dyadic interactions, mothers and infants, going up to larger groups. And I wouldn't say any is more natural. Whether music as it stands in humans now would evolve without one of those is a question we'll never know. But it's not meant to say one's more natural. It's just one is more I'm afraid I don't have a good answer because I wanted to say that more is what the way we think about music being practiced in many cultures in terms of having multiple participants. But then again, if you think about pianos in the home in the earlier centuries, and if you think about now, and of course there's a lot of research on this, music being engaged in by individuals with streaming services, Spotify and so on, it's a difficult question. I guess I wouldn't say it's more natural, but you can also read it as complex in an ecologically realistic way. Complexity in an ecologically realistic way would be another way to recode that dimension. I see a couple of questions in the chat from Natalie Palooza. I don't know if you noticed.
Yes. So, well, we hit the first one there. So second one, we talked a bit before about pedagogical implications. So here she's asking about expanding resource availability for musicians in terms of training. So yes. I don't know if you have any specific thoughts on that.
That's an interesting question, because on one hand, you could think that that's going to be more or less fixed. I think it's maybe developing strategies to make the most of the availability and not have it robbed by extraneous things, techniques for concentrating and focusing on the job at hand. Not being distracted, in other words. But also, there's another thing, for the system to work the way I'd envisaged it, availability is not a constant thing. The reason behind that is having constant availability would not be functional because it wouldn't be sustained. Fatigue occurs. We know this from research with air traffic controllers and other applied domains. So it needs to fluctuate in a way that is lawfully related to activity demands. So that might vary depending on the musical genre or style, whether it's strictly metric, hierarchically metric or not. It might vary with tempo as well. So I don't really have an answer about how it can be trained, but I can imagine that it'll be useful to either make the most of it by developing strategies to avoid distraction and developing ways to be more flexible in how it is allocated over time.
Fantastic. Great answer. Well, thank you so much. I know it's almost midnight in your time there, and I think we have you on the hook for yet another session of a group Q&A. So I wanted to bring back Dr. Laurel Trainer now to moderate our session of discussion amongst all the speakers.